auditorium, and if you're on the live stream, thank you for being there as well. Difficult finding answers to tough questions. And all of these questions have been your questions, by the way, and kind of finishing that up for the most part this morning. And I got to ask a really difficult question this morning. And the question was simply, why was it necessary for Jesus to die? Now, I know who asked this question because it was asked to me in person, so that helped a little bit in trying to figure out how to answer it. But it's a tough question because this question isn't really about necessarily sacrifice or redemption or ransom, although all of those kind of fit into the answer in a way. Specifically, the question is more, why did Jesus, as the Son of God, why was it necessary for him to experience death in the flesh? I mean, why didn't God choose something else? Or was it even possible for God to choose something else? For example, why couldn't he have been like Enoch, who it just said Enoch walked with God? Or if you look at the prophet Elijah and he was taken up in the fiery chariot, why couldn't Jesus have been like that? Why did the Son of God need to die on the cross? Not a question about redemption or ransom, but why was it necessary for him to die such a cruel death? You know, it's a good question, too, for this time of year, isn't it? Because this time of year, Christmas. So usually when you think of Christmas, or at least if I think of Christmas, or the time that we consider to be Christmas, I usually think about Christ's birth. And that's just kind of a common topic for us at this time of the year. It's, you know, you start thinking about that Emmanuel, or God with us, or baby in a manger, the Star of Bethlehem, angels rejoicing, wise men visiting. I mean, even this morning we have like a stable, and we have a manger. It's got a baby in it. And by the way, quick commercial. That's for next Sunday. Because next Sunday, you're not going to hear me preach. I have a little talk at the end, okay? But you're not going to hear me preach next Sunday. Next Sunday, our, I guess high school and down. Is that right? High school and down? High school and down is going to do this this play about the birth of Jesus. And it's going to be and it's going to take the place of the sermon, and you don't want to miss it because they've been practicing every Wednesday night, right? So you want to be here next Sunday to see that. So that's my shameless commercial this morning, all right? But can you imagine a young Jewish mom being so excited about the birth of a baby, and she wraps him in the cloth, and he probably looked like any other baby, but Mary knew that this was not just any other baby. This was the Son of God, the gift of God for the world. He was the Savior, the Messiah that they have waited on for so long. And I mean, if you can just imagine the excitement that she had with that, can you imagine the heartache as she stood at the foot of the cross, watching that, what would have still been a child to her, I'm sure, die on that cross? And why was it necessary? Why did Jesus need to die? If you think about that question, it has been a challenge for the church from the very beginning. Paul, when he writes 1 Corinthians, he said, we preach Christ crucified. I forgot to do all of my slides there, but that's okay. A stumbling block to the Jews, and foolishness to Gentiles, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. To the Gentiles, the cross made no sense. Proclaiming a crucified Savior, somebody who died as God. That didn't go along with their ideas of the ancient world and antiquity, and they just considered it foolishness. Justin Martyr wrote a passage one time about the crucified Savior, and he said, they say that our madness consists in the fact that we put a crucified man in second place after the unchangeable and eternal God, the creator of the world. A crucified man. To the Greeks, to the Jews, it made no sense at all. Cursed is everyone who's hung on a tree, the old law said. And here's Jesus hung on a tree, crucified. Surely the Messiah, the Son of God, God's anointed, could not be cursed. And yet Jesus hung on the tree. Why was it necessary for Jesus to die? In the beginning, it's going to be a long sermon when you start with in the beginning, isn't it? So I hope you packed a lunch. In the beginning, God created Adam. Now, I'm just reminding you of what you already know. God gave Adam one recorded command. One. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. One command. Now, you know the rest of the story in Paul Harvey language, right? Satan deceived Eve. Eve ate from the tree. Adam ate from the tree. And death entered the world. And from that time, death has tormented us as humanity. It's impacted everybody here. Father, mother, a son, daughter, grandfather, grandmother, relative, friend. We've attended multiple funerals in our lifetimes. And if we live on this earth, we will attend many more. And death strikes at the heart of our mortality more than anything else. It's one of those things we can't overcome by our own ability. There is this helplessness, this emptiness about it. And sometimes, we make jokes about it, but it's serious. It doesn't escape us. It is a human experience that seems absolutely final to everything else when you separate it from faith and resurrection. Dying is the last thing we do on this earth. And hopefully you maybe, I don't even know how to phrase this statement. I don't know if you've ever seen someone take the final breath. It seems so final. And we observe it every day. Sickness, cancer, COVID, pneumonia, flu, heart attacks, strokes, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, accidents, natural disasters, murder, suicide, or just old age. Our community is experiencing it today. The death of Gabriel Sisk, young man. Some of you knew Gabriel. I did not. Thursday night, series of tornadoes who went through multiple states that people have lost loved ones and lost family members whose lives have been turned upside down and everything devastated in just a few moments. This past Thursday marked 33 years that a good friend of mine was killed in an auto accident because his Bronco 2 hit a patch of black ice and flipped end over end. And you think, why did it happen? Why did there have to be black ice on the road that day? And the reality is, as humanity, we have no cure. We can't find a way to overcome the curse of death that came because sin came into the world. And we've tried. I mean, doctors and nurses can do amazing things, can't they? And God uses them to prolong our lives. But even the best medical practices cannot prevent death. And then after death, any ability that man has to bring healing instantly stops because we have no cure for the problem. And the only cure for the problem of death is the resurrection of Jesus. But you can't have resurrection without having death. So the death of Jesus is the necessary prerequisite for the resurrection of Jesus. You know, you can read this if you get your Bible, 1 Corinthians. I want to put some passages up here, and instead of putting the passage up there, I just put where it is so you can read along so that you know this is in your Bible, all right? For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead also comes through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive, but each in its turn. Christ the firstfruits, then when he comes, those who belong to him. Then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power, for he must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet, and the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Death came through a man. And what Paul is emphasizing there in the way that he writes that, there is this continuous cycle. And it never stops. It started with Adam and Eve, and the continuous cycle that never stops is man dies. And it keeps going. As long as the earth exists, it will keep going. It doesn't stop. It doesn't have an end space. Everyone will die. Now, I know we've got Enoch, all right? I know we've got Elijah. They're kind of exceptions. But he balances that, so you've got one man brings death, one man brings life, and the life is the resurrection. We will all be raised. So we'll all be made alive again. So it's through the resurrection that Jesus brings the hope. But if you don't have the death, you can't have the resurrection. You can't conquer death unless you've experienced death. And that's one of the reasons it was necessary for Jesus to die on the cross. Death was made effective by a human being, and the only way to make it ineffective is with a human being. And Jesus came into the world to destroy death. He set us free from fear of death. If you turn over to Hebrews chapter 4, there's another passage. Oh, let me do this. Travis, you keep up with me back there if I forget. So let's go to Hebrews 2 first, then we'll come back. Hebrews chapter 2. Y'all can probably get to it faster on your iPad than I can get to it through a real book, can't you? Since the children have flesh and blood, that's us, by the way. We're the children who have flesh and blood. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity so that by his death he might break the power of him who's the power of the death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Okay, well, don't just read over that too quickly. What did he do? I mean, just kind of think about that, what he did, what the writer of Hebrews wrote for a second right there. He broke the power of him who holds the power of death, which is the devil. So the devil holds the power of death, and then Jesus holds the power of resurrection. For it is surely not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. And for this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. He freed those who are held in slavery by their fear of death. He broke the power of the one who holds the power of death, that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. Yes, there is an atonement in there. Jesus gave his life for us so that by his sin, by his sacrifice, our sins might be forgiven, so that we can live to him, and by that he gives us the power of the resurrection. Just that idea, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. Jesus redeems us from our sin, but it's through the power of the resurrection that he's declared to be the Son of God with power. Paul writes about that in Romans chapter 1. We don't take time to read that. I'll just read it to you though. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the glory of God, the gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures regarding his Son. Now listen to this. As to his human nature was a descendant of David, but who the Spirit of holiness was declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. How was he declared with power to be the Son of God? Y'all can answer this, by the way, okay? Resurrection. Okay, what do you have to have before you can have resurrection? You have to have death. So if you go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And just listen. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I didn't mean to get to that slide yet. Sorry about that. Skip this one. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 50. I declare to you, brothers, sisters, that flesh cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, and sleep represents death. But we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and mortal with immortality. But when the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, which Jesus took away by his sacrifice. The power of sin is the law, which now that we are believers in Jesus, every righteous requirement of the law is met in us. But thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. The victory. See, the power of sin is death. So what happens is, remember back in the very beginning, how many commands did God give Adam? 1. And he broke it, right? 1. And so death entered the world. So then here we are in the world, and the sting of death is sin. And I don't want to break your heart, but most of you who are old enough to know right from wrong, you're all sinners. Every last one of you. And what happens with sinners? Sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. We die. It's the curse that came into humanity. Now, every righteous requirement of the law is met in us. And there's where the sacrifice of Jesus come in. He became, the one who knew no sin became sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So you are completely clean and pure because of the faith that you have in Jesus. So even though you're a sinner, God does not view you as a sinner. He views you as righteous because of the faith that you have in Jesus. So the resurrection that Jesus experienced is a resurrection that I am going to experience. And that, I think, is why Jesus had to die on the cross. Not just because of atonement and sacrifice. You know, it's very difficult when you get into questions like this, so you're trying to get into the mind of God, and I'm just telling you, none of us are smart enough to get into the mind of God, okay? It's like here, and we're like way down here. So that mother stood at the foot of the cross. And she watched her son die. They took him down. They prepared him for burial. And they placed him in a tomb. And if you think about the text, it wasn't even a family tomb. It was a tomb that somebody donated. The next day was a Sabbath. They would have stayed home. The day after that, they would have honored Jesus. There were some women who were going to do it by taking spices. And they got to that tomb, and the stone was gone. It was rolled away. And there was no Jesus in the tomb because Jesus was resurrected. Do you realize that the resurrection of Jesus is uniquely different than any other resurrection in the Bible? It's uniquely different because Jesus, after his resurrection, appeared over 40 days, and then they watched him ascend to the side of God, ascend to heaven on the clouds. He died and he was resurrected, never to die again, so that by his death, he destroyed the power of death and brings only life. And every one of us who are sitting in this auditorium are probably anticipating the glory of resurrection, of eternal life, the gift of God through Jesus. So I think the reason Jesus died such a cruel death was not, part of it, and we didn't cover that much this morning, but part of it was the sacrifice that was made for the sins of the people, for us. We honored that with communion when we talked about the body of Jesus and the blood, and by his blood we are saved, and by his sacrifice we are saved. And don't ever forget that part. So that's part of the equation, but the other part of that equation is Jesus died so that he could be resurrected, so that he could destroy death and bring us hope. And that's the hope that I live by. I was talking to somebody last week, and they were talking about, George Clark, who was a preacher at the First Baptist in Pleasant View is where George preached, and it was actually James Victory from Droylton Church of Christ that I was talking to, and James was telling this story about he was in Subway one day, and he was been talking to this guy about salvation and eternity and all of that stuff, and George was not with them. He was sitting at another table, and during the discussion, George gets up and he walks over to James and he starts talking to them, and they're discussing things, and this guy looks up at George and he says, well, how long are you going to live? And he said, forever. And that's the greatest answer. And how long are you going to live? Forever. Because of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, does death bring sadness to our world? It does, doesn't it? There's a finality about that just it rips at our hearts. There is something about dealing with death that it can bring pain and hurt. And it's real pain and it's real hurt. And I don't want to try to brush that aside in any way. Voices that we don't hear, people that we can't call, people that we don't see, empty chairs at holidays and birthdays and special events. But the resurrection of Jesus shows me that is not the end. So we don't grieve like people who have no hope because of the resurrection of Jesus. So this holiday season, I promise you, you're going to drive around and you're going to see manger scenes and nativity scenes, and people are going to be talking about the birth of Jesus. And the birth of Jesus is an incredible thing, isn't it? But in his resurrection, he destroys death and brings us hope. So if you walk up to me and say, Greg, how long are you going to live? Forever. In this body? Oh, yeah, after the resurrection. Yeah, after the resurrection, this body. That is the hope that we have in Jesus. We think about the cross, painful death. And we think about the resurrection, incredible hope. The only question I have for you is really simple. Where are you going to live forever? Where are you going to live forever because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ? When the forever gets here, will you be in the presence of God? And if you're not, find faith in Jesus.